Concorde was one of the most famous aircraft ever built, but it was also possibly one of aviation's biggest commercial failures. So why have some of the biggest airlines out there already ordered over 130 of Boom's new Overture supersonic aircraft before they've even left the prototype stage? So are the companies who are creating supersonic aircraft right now about to redefine the future of aviation, or are they simply set to repeat some of the mistakes that we saw in Concorde's past?
It's been more than 20 years now since the last Concorde flew, but the idea of supersonic flight is far from dead. Right now, there are companies like Boom Supersonic who are trying to bring passenger supersonic flight back to commercial operation. The promise is quite simple: cross oceans in half the time, make speed the new luxury, and fix the problems that made Concorde so difficult to operate. But have those problems actually been fixed? Well, Boom's XB1 demonstrator has now flown faster than the speed of sound, and the company says those tests have helped to prove that they can fly faster than the speed of sound without creating an audible sonic boom. But the sonic boom was only one of Concorde's problems. You see, there was the issue of the fuel burn, there was the noise, there was the ticket prices, the tiny market, it had limited routes, there was the operating costs.
There was also the fleet issue, because only 20 of these Concordes were made and only 14 flew in active commercial service. So if you were a British Airways or an Air France and one of your supersonic aircraft was out of action and you didn't have one to replace it with, what do you do for all those passengers? Do you put them on a flight or on an aircraft which is going to be slower, therefore they're not getting the supersonic experience that they paid a fair hefty ticket price for? There's also the problem that Concorde had with the airports it was going in and out of as well from a physical perspective, because this aircraft required quite a long takeoff roll and landing rollout as well. And then the final problem that Concorde had, which is probably the one that it's most known for, was of course the noise. So what actually causes a sonic boom? Well, every aircraft creates pressure waves in the air. If you think about a boat moving through the water, you've seen the ripples of water that it creates. Well, the fluid dynamics of a boat moving through water operate in almost an identical way to an aircraft moving through the air. At normal speeds, these pressure waves can travel ahead of the aircraft, but once the aircraft reaches the speed of sound, it's now moving just as fast as those waves themselves. And they build up into a single powerful shockwave behind the aircraft into what we recognise as a sonic boom. Which is not really a problem up at cruising altitude, but the trouble is that sonic boom also makes its way down to the ground, and it's on the ground where those booms were heard over populated areas as this aircraft was building up and passing supersonic speeds that really caused quite a lot of problem when it comes to the noise complaints that were related to Concorde. Boom's answer to the sonic boom problem is something that they're calling Boomless Cruise. So instead of flying supersonically all the time, the idea is to accelerate only in parts of the atmosphere where they can use a phenomenon called Mach cutoff, where the shockwave still exists. I mean, you can't change the laws of physics. You're flying an aircraft faster than the speed of sound, you're going to create a big shockwave. But they're creating the shockwave in conditions where they are confident the shockwave won't actually reach the ground. Now, this requires a certain set of atmospheric conditions. Basically, it requires the temperature profile, how things are going from hot to cold through the atmosphere, to meet a certain set of criteria. It also requires the aircraft to be flying fairly high up, so it can only really start its Boomless Cruise above 30,000 feet. And it only works if the aircraft is traveling a little bit above the speed of sound. And on their website, they cite 1.3 times the speed of sound, so 30% above the speed of sound. But in those conditions, which the aircraft will tell them if the aircraft is operating in those conditions, at a certain height and at a certain speed, Boom are saying that yes, there will be a sonic boom, but you're not going to hear it if you're on the ground. So in some ways, I think this is incredibly clever. They're not trying to stop the sonic boom from existing, because the sonic boom will exist. What Boom are trying to do is find those right atmospheric conditions so that boom doesn't reach the people on the ground. I think that's fantastic, incredibly clever. What a wonderful use of physics and technology in the aviation world. A concern with that, though, obviously is, well, what happens if you are set off to fly from London to New York, say, and those conditions don't exist? Does the aircraft then not go into its boomless cruise state? Can it not go faster than the speed of sound? Well, what Boom have said to that is that they still obviously will fly the aircraft supersonic. They just won't reach those supersonic speeds whilst they are over populated areas. So the aircraft will go supersonic in the same way that Concorde did over the water, so that the sonic boom will reach the ground, but I mean, unless you're a fisherman or someone on a cruise ship down below, nobody is basically going to hear it because the aircraft won't be over a populated area. This particular Concorde that's behind me here for making this video today, this is in a place called Brooklands Museum. It's about an hour's train ride southwest out of London. It's one of a few that you can still see as static exhibits all around the world, but here in the UK, Brooklands I would recommend you come to. Duxford is another museum, the Imperial War Museum up there in Duxford. You can fly into that airport as well if you've got a small aircraft and you like flying. There's Yeovilton in the UK as well. There's also the Concorde that you may have seen if you've flown in and out of Heathrow Airport. If you're taking off on runway 27, I think it's 27 on the left-hand side of the airport, you sit on the left-hand side of the plane, then you quite often taxi past the Concorde that's there as a static exhibit. You can't visit that one, unfortunately. You can only see it from taxiing aircraft. But if you want to get up close and personal to a Concorde like I am today, I'd thoroughly recommend Brooklands. The other nice thing about this exhibit as well is they've just turned all the electrics on the aircraft as well. So not only can you see the aircraft just sort of sitting here, you can go inside on tours as well. But because they've got the electrics on, the landing lights are on now. They've just turned the beacons on, which normally means that the engines are about to start up, which, like, I wouldn't be mad about. That'd be cool to see. But so what are some of the reasons then why Concorde failed as an aviation business? Well, the first one is probably ticket prices. I mean, you had to pay a premium to fly supersonic flight and spend between 3 and 4 hours getting between London and New York on this aircraft, and therefore it very much was a travel option for the elite, and the ticket prices meant it wasn't accessible to everybody, and so therefore it was quite a limited market of people who could fly on this aircraft. Second reason was probably fuel burn and economy. Just really roughly, I was looking up some numbers and I found this really interesting, is that to get this aircraft up to Mach 1, up to supersonic speed, when the afterburners are on at the back of the aircraft, this thing can burn 32 litres of fuel per second. It's also a very thirsty aircraft on the ground as well, just to taxi this aircraft. And again, depending on the distance that you're taxiing, which gate you're going to, all sorts of factors. But anecdotally, to taxi this aircraft used up 2 tons of fuel. But that's even before the wheels have lifted off from the ground and it's gone anywhere. Then there was the range issue with Concorde as well. Now, range is an interesting one when it comes to talking about an aircraft, because manufacturers will always overstate a range, customers will always understate a range, etc. But when you look at sort of perfect conditions for an aircraft like this, it could fly generally around 4,500 nautical miles. Now, if there's no one on board, it can go further, yada yada, but say 4,500 miles. In equivalent conditions, if you look at something like even a 747 from the same era, an older 747-400, for example, that could do around 7,500 to 8,000 miles, almost twice as far. And of course, it could carry a lot more passengers as well. It was also quite restricted in terms of the airports that Concorde could fly in and out of as well. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that it is so aerodynamically efficient. The delta wing design, the thin fuselage meant that it was fantastic if you're trying to fly this aircraft high and fast. But unfortunately, when you're down low, an aircraft needs to be flown as slow as possible before you touch down for landing, obviously, but this aircraft couldn't fly as slowly low down as others. And so it did require a longer takeoff roll than other aircraft would.
So how is Boom's new Overture actually planning to deal with those problems that Concorde had that we discussed earlier on? When it comes to fuel burn, there's got to be a massive benefit from the recent developments in engine technology. In fact, Boom themselves are developing their own engine called Symphony, specifically for Overture. It's a purpose-built turbofan designed for efficient supersonic flight without the afterburners that Concorde needed, and it will also be compatible to burn 100% of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. The noise issue, well, that hasn't disappeared, but as we saw earlier, Boomless Cruise is kind of hiding it. Under the right conditions, you shouldn't hear the sonic boom if you're on the ground, and that's going to be a big advantage to this new aircraft. Ticket prices, well, they're still pretty uncertain at the moment. Boom says that they're targeting fares comparable with today's business class, but ultimately the manufacturer doesn't dictate the ticket prices. That'll be down to the airlines, who decide what passengers actually pay. In terms of the market size, well, Overture's already being backed by global airlines with orders and pre-orders of 130 aircraft across United, American and JAL. So those big airlines certainly believe that there is a market for it, and that could help solve the limited route problem that Concorde had, with Boom themselves believing that Overture could eventually operate profitably on more than 600 routes worldwide. But perhaps the biggest unknown is still the operating cost. Boom says its purpose-built engines should reduce overall costs, and the newer technology, you would think, should run more efficiently. But until the airlines actually start flying Overture, there's simply no way of knowing whether Overture will be operationally more efficient to run than Concorde was back in its time.
This particular aircraft at Brooklands, this is it's Golf Bravo Bravo Delta Golf. This was the first production version of Concorde here in Britain. It flew in 1974, was the first flight for this aircraft, and it was actually used as part of the certification process as well from the Civil Aviation Authority as a test case, basically to prove that supersonic flight was possible and safe for commercial usage. This Concorde also holds the record for being the first Concorde to ever fly more than 100 people at supersonic speeds, which I think is pretty cool. If you were one of those 100 people that were on that flight back in the 70s, I mean, what an experience. I've never flown an aircraft, as most of us actually watching this wouldn't have, because apart from Concorde, no commercial aircraft has ever flown supersonic. So very few of us would have experienced that in the past. But for those 100 people in the test days in the early 1970s when they were trying to prove the concept of supersonic flight, what an experience that would have been. Final issue out of this whole Concorde story is, if we are going to have supersonic flight in the future, is there an economic desire for it? Does the market actually want it? Would you as a passenger be willing to pay more just to go faster? Well, I think in a way, in a slight tangent here, but Qantas are actually betting at the moment that yes, you as a passenger will pay to go faster with things like Project Sunrise due to come out in 2027, where you will pay a premium to have the luxury and privilege of being able to fly non-stop from the east coast of Australia to places like London or New York, whereas currently you do have to stop, adding about 3 to 4 hours for the layover to your journey. So yes, there is a premium that comes with speed, but airlines are betting that you will be willing to pay for that. And I think the same goes for those that are betting on the supersonic era as well. Concorde proved that supersonic flight was possible. In fact, it became one of the most iconic aircraft I think that humans have ever built. However, it did also teach us that supersonic flight probably wasn't as economically viable as we maybe first thought. And now companies like Boom are coming along with newer designs of supersonic aircraft, more sustainable fuel, more efficient engines, aircraft that can operate out of more places, better cockpit design, and potentially solving the sonic boom problem as well. So is supersonic flight going to be on the radar anytime soon again? Well, whilst Concorde might have shown us that supersonic flight was possible, Boom, however, they've got to show us it's profitable. I love it so much. Such a cool plane.